Hello. Welcome to another podcast. It's a nice kind of gloomy April today. It may not be gloomy because we have our guest here today, Jorge Rivera, executive co-director of the People's Resource Center and the co-founder of the San Gabriel Tenants Alliance. Did I get that right? I always like to make sure. I tend to
Yeah,
always
the San
make
Gabriel Valley Tennis Alliance.
San Gabriel Valley. I always
Yeah,
It's always something. Oh, San Gabriel Valley Tenants Alliance is always something. Always something I miss.
yeah.
I know. I'm so sorry.
No, that's all good. It's a,
um,
it's a long name.
it's a long name. So today, what we want to do is to, we've really throughout kind of these months, we went really deep on a lot of racial issues, the you know the hate against the Asian American community, and there's been just a lot of updates that's just been happening. Like the world's just kind of keep going on, but today we wanted to just kind of focus in on housing and it's kind of the things that we're going to be looking down the line in terms of like what our communities would look like um in the future, because high priced housing will kick a lot of folks that work and live in these specific areas. We discussed this with our previous guest Eric Sonata, but Jorge is here. He We're gonna just have a conversation about you know the issues of housing in the San Gabriel Valley. And I know each community probably goes through it very differently and very distinctly. I think today we're going to discuss several different places across the US, but I just want to start by asking you, Jorge, what got you involved in working for or advocating for tenants and, housing rights for the community?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me on, Brian. Always a pleasure to talk about this topic that is so very near and dear to my heart. I got involved actually by an organizer that was organizing tenants. I was working on a film project when I was living in Long Beach, and I was interviewing various community groups about the work that they were doing so that I can try to educate sort of the masses of Long Beach of all the great stuff that was happening. And I came across this organization that I wanted to interview, that I was told that I should talk to. And in speaking with them, I basically learned about their work around systems change and organizing,
Mhm.
and I just fell in love with the idea and the concept. And I think the reason why I did is because when I first got out of college, I went into social work and foster care,
Mhm.
and I only lasted about 5 years before I got really disenchanted and left social work completely. And looking back on it, the reason why I left is because I felt that it was an industry or a system that was not working. I didn't feel like I was doing any good in it, that
Mhm.
I was helping anybody, and I got disenchanted with that system. And then fast forward like 10 years later, I came across this organization, and they were talking about systems change. And
Mhm.
this is not something that I learned at school, that I was taught about, and I wanted to learn more. And so I volunteered for that organization for about a year before I got hired on as staff. And I've been organizing ever since for almost 10 years now.
It's the organization's called System Change.
No,
Oh,
the
okay.
organization, I don't think that it's around anymore, but it was Housing Long Beach,
Mm-hmm.
and they were talking about systems change, and like changing the system for
Mm-hmm.
tenants and for housing. And yeah, I basically I was all in. I volunteered almost full time for an entire year. I learned as much as I could. I
Mm-hmm.
learned about organizing. I learned about tenants rights and housing law. And what helped was the fact that I did social work before, and I did real estate and loans for about 10 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very familiar with that segment of sort of the housing world. And and I had an opportunity to really make a change. And
Right.
so that was all in.
Yeah. So speaking of systems change, I remember the guest now. It was Allison Henry. Well, our previous guest to talk about housing and like what a tenants union can provide for a community. But when we're talking about systems, I just wanted to ask, like, in your opinion, what are the ways people get into an unhoused situation? Because the way I feel about it is that, you can have a situation like '08 where, you believe that you have enough money to buy this home, you get this loan, and then somehow or another, the bubble hits, right? And then you can't afford this home anymore. And I think in this way, it's almost been, at this point, it's been a decade since then. Has the mechanisms or the things that are pushing people to an unhoused situation changed, or is it still about the same?
I think it's still about the same.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of that bubble back
Mm-hmm.
in the 2006. I mean, the world knows of the bubble bursting in 2008, but we were doing real estate and loans back then, and we felt it in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the banks really started to pull all of the different loan products. They started to make things tighter as far as qualifying requirements. And then 2 years later, then we started to hear about everybody losing their homes because they were in these really bad loan
Mm-hmm.
products that they just couldn't afford anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like going back to your question, it's like, no, I don't think it's changed. With respect to like home buying, they've made it a little bit harder to qualify for a loan. They got really strict on their eligibility and qualification standards, and so I think it's a little bit tougher to buy a home now, just because they're more stringent on what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah,
more tougher, and it's probably also not as tough for some folks. As we were talking in our pre-interview thing, where
yeah,
I think our previous guest one time has suggested that a solution to all our problems could be, adding more housing stock and doing the things that can house more people in a least amount of times, and like putting the pressure for construction and all of these places. But even when we do build more homes, even when we do those things, there are I remember watching this thing on Rising where they were talking about how it's not you, the consumer, it's these corporations, it's these investing groups, it's these entities. I wouldn't say individuals, but these entities that basically take these markets out of the market and then use them as rental properties. And it gets to a point, and this is just my personal opinion, is like, how much is enough wealth for these corporations and these investors? Because it's like you're pushing many people out of like these communities. So I don't know, maybe do you have a sense that like this argument is like we need to build more housing to fix all of our problems? Is that something that we should consider, or like should there be a much more structural um thing in place, whether if that's a state or a federal thing?
yeah. I think just to start off with, where I believe that we're not going to build our way out of this problem.
Mhm.
There's no way that we're going to be able to build enough homes to satisfy the need, and so I agree that there needs to be legislation and political pressure to build more housing, but it also has to be very specific to the people that need it the most.
Mhm.
We don't build enough low-income housing, and the federal government defines affordable housing in four different income levels,
Mhm.
ranging from extremely low to moderate income, and those ranges of income can vary depending on the area. But when we're talking about extremely low, we're talking about the folks that are earning like 15 to $20,000 or less.
Mhm.
And these are the folks that are most at risk of housing instability, or most at risk of being unhoused. So, but we're not building homes for them. we're not building homes that are affordable to them, and we rely on subsidy programs like HUD, the federal government, to subsidize construction of low-income projects, and there's not enough funding there, and also it's difficult for nonprofit organizations that do housing development to actually build enough housing,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so hard to find the financing and the funding to be able to build these projects. So there's not enough resources financially, there's not enough political will,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not enough policy to be able to build the housing that we need for everybody and all the different income levels. So one, we can't just talk about just building housing. We have to talk about building housing for the people that are most impacted, that are most in need. And that's just one strategy. We're not going to build our way out of this problem. I think that we need to employ different measures. It's got to be multifaceted approach. It can't just be this one silver bullet. I don't think that that's even practical. We
Mm-hmm.
need to be able to keep people in their homes. Like I always tell people, is like we have to stop the bleeding. Our homeless and our unhoused population continues to grow, even in the midst of all these different tenant protections that are enacted through COVID. Is like the population is still growing, and so we need to stop the bleeding, and that means keeping people in their homes for as long as is possible, protecting tenants from becoming unhoused. And then as we do that, then we have to also focus in on building affordable housing that is deeply affordable for even the lowest income
Mm-hmm.
levels.
So is building these types of homes and then like these how low income house or affordable housing areas, why does it take so much to do so? Is it because developers are not interested, or is it, based on what factors it that's a barrier to build more affordable housing? Sorry, I mumbled my way through that.
Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, well, one of the barriers is financial barrier. If you talk to affordable housing developers, you'll learn that they takes multiple streams of funding just to build one project. One affordable housing developer told us that one project they had to get 12 different forms of funding.
Mhm.
That means from different sources. And usually, usually there has to be a local source of funding that is sort of anchoring the project. So for example, if we wanted to build something here in San Gabriel Valley, or let's say one of the cities in San Gabriel Valley where I reside right now in Duarte, is like Duarte has to have its own funding to invest in the project. And then the developer would be able to leverage that funding to get funding from the state, funding from the federal government, and funding from other different sources. But it's difficult for the state or the federal government to give funding when there's no local investment. It's sort of like saying, "Hey, Bryan, I want to open up a restaurant, and would you invest, $100,000 in it?" And then you ask me, it's like, "Well, how much are you putting in?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm not putting in anything." Like, how safe are you going to feel
Mhm.
investing $100,000 in my project when I have no skin in the game?
Mhm.
Right. So the same thing with like the state and these other funding sources. They want to see that the local community has skin in the game.
Mhm.
And so local cities need to start doing some fund development for affordable housing development to attract those affordable housing projects into their
Mhm.
community. And then there's other, like, there's policies like inclusionary zoning ordinances, which basically says that any new development in the city, a certain percentage is going to be allocated to affordable housing. And
Mhm.
and then very specifically saying in those ordinances that let's say 15% of all new development has to be for extremely low income housing. right? And then that forces the developers that if they want to develop these market rate homes, it's like, okay, you're going to have to set aside some and figure out the financing to do housing for extremely low people. And so it forces them to look for different financial means, and that's just one barrier, the financing, right? And then there's one of the other barriers is just the cost of materials. The cost of materials to build homes in California and just across the United States is getting more and more costly, which means that there needs to be more and more funding for it. And so that means that the state's got to put some stuff into the game. The federal government's got to put some stuff into the game. But we need to definitely incentivize and motivate these affordable housing developers to build more of what they do.
I'm trying to remember before the Alhambra source was put on hiatus, that one of the last articles they posted is that I think the housing kind of project that was proposed near Spartan Final on Los Tunas. This is a very local podcast, by the way.
Yeah.
But it was called the Mariposa, and so for this development to go through, I think the city was asking, "Listen, this is cool, but we want some affordable housing in this project." And I think it took some community leaders to like come in and say, "Hey, we it's not that we don't want development, but we want something to make sure that folks that are living on the edge can have a place to live." And so I think somewhere along the lines, I think they got it through, and the developer redesigned their development so they can include it. So this was an example of like a developer coming in, listening to the city and saying like, "Hey, this is what we should do," versus what's been happening on the other one on Fremont, the villages. There you go. The whole villages situation, which ever since this is a separate issue. Ever since the source is gone, it's like I feel like there's nothing coming out about what's the details of that project, and everything has all been just kind of radio silent. And I wish we had more local journalists covering this situation where a company's just like, "Hey, we don't care. We're just going to build market rate housing and do nothing about it." Anyway, so
well, I mean, it's got to pencil out. It's got to pencil out for them, right? Financially, it's got to make sense for them in order to have them want to develop it. So like, say for example, that market rate project is like, if the city wants to incentivize that developer to set aside some of those units for affordable housing, is like, well, it's got to pencil out for that developer, otherwise they're not going to build any. And so that means you got to subsidize it, give them, invest some money into the project so that they can set aside some of that housing. And these inclusionary zoning policies, they have to mandate affordable housing development, because if they don't, like some cities, they have a voluntary option to build affordable housing, and if they choose not to build it, then they have to pay a fee to not build it, right? But most of the times they're more than happy to pay the fee, because they know they're going to make a lot more money on a market rate unit than on an affordable unit. So we can't have these ordinances and policies that give the developers the option to not build. It should be mandated to have to build.
Speaking of incentivization, and I think you mentioned here, like, please build unless you'll pay a fee. I don't know if it was Monrovia or Pasadena, but like, if you want to develop higher than a certain amount of stories, you got to put in more affordable housing, or like, it can't all just be office building. So I don't know if it was Pasadena or Monrovia, but when they put that in, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, just kind of like saying to the developers, it's like, we don't want to waste space in such a small city like of ours, and like, if you're just gonna build whatever you want, that's not gonna fly in our community, essentially.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are the kind of policies that need to be put into place, because this, like, build it if you want to kind of attitude is like, they're going to be like, nah, I don't want to. I'd rather make money. They don't care about the people that that we're trying to house and that we
Right.
want to make sure that have a home. But it's like they care more about
Hmm.
their pocketbook than they do the people. So
Um, I did want to ask you because we did discuss a lot about, investment, funding, and all of those things. Sorry, it's a crowded house. The One of the things that's been coming up lately in the United States is the idea of infrastructure, right? Building more pipes, getting more funding for elder care and all of these different things. Does it like is there space in that plan to make sure that we have some form of like investments into affordable housing? Because I feel like everything's all roads and bridges and pipes and taking out lead pipes and all of these things, but it felt like, well, shouldn't a concerned infrastructure plan also include paying to build houses? Didn't we do that like even back in the 50s to some degree? I'm not saying the 50s is the gold
yeah,
standard, but like
sure.
we've done in examples in our history that we invested in housing before.
Well, I think I'm in agreement with some of the tenant advocate positions or the housing advocate positions that are saying that housing should be infrastructure, and
Hmm.
making sure that people have homes should be part of the infrastructure plan. But I don't think that that's how they look at it, or they've intended it. But I think with more advocacy, hopefully they might at least start to raise an eyebrow with it. And yeah, that would be the ideal. Again, like I said, you got to do these two things at the very minimum concurrently: build
Hmm.
more housing that's affordable for the people that need it the most, and make sure that people are not getting kicked out on the streets for lack of protection, right?
Right.
There's got to be protection to keep people in their homes at the same time that we're trying to build more to fill the need.
So shifting a little bit on kind of like I guess the more hotter topic, which is the I guess controversial, I guess, in terms of like, the homeless population in Los Angeles.
Mm,
You hear it from conservative pundits all the time. It's like LA is unlivable and like they're moving off into to Texas, to Tennessee, and all of those things. But I feel that sort of argument is very like a regressive. It's like you're you hate it so much that you leave versus staying and doing something about it or advocating for other people. And I've had this conversation with Eric before, and it said, it's for a city, it's much more easier to pay them to be housed than to police them, you know, the homeless people. And it just kind of boggles my mind. It seems on paper that the way to fix this is easy, right? But it's almost, as we mentioned before, it's we either lost the political will, or I guess there's not much pressure from the public to say do something about it. What do you think about that notion that I brought up, at least?
well, I mean, I agree with you in that studies time and time again have shown that it costs us, the taxpayers, a lot more money to try um, to care for the people that are unhoused, because of healthcare, emergency room, policing, all of this stuff. A lot more money than it does to house them, right? To build them housing, and so it's almost mind-boggling that folks have not done something about it. I mean, if we know that it would save taxpayer money, and we can solve the unhoused problem, is like, why haven't we taken the steps to do that? And to be quite honest, I don't even know how to answer or respond to that, because not
Mm-hmm.
being inside the minds of some of these politicians, I have no understanding of why that is. Yeah, I mean, there's some more like some of the more conspiracy theories is that there are people that are getting rich and getting a lot of money having people that are unhoused, and so
Mm-hmm.
therefore there's a lot of opposition of just making that issue go away. but I don't know who those people might be and what angles they're taking. But it just it doesn't make any sense to me. It does not make any sense to me when we
Hmm.
know that it can save us money in the long run, and it can also alleviate the pressures and the issues that people are having with the unhoused population.
Yeah, and
So I don't get it.
yeah, I don't get it either. It's like it's a way to ease suffering amongst, communities that are suffering from poverty. Being unhoused, you know you just kind of imagine what does that does to a person's not only physical health but also their mental health too. And if we're kicking people off to the curb, um for any reasons, like I can't imagine what does that do to a person. I think Allison Henry
Yeah,
said this before, is that if you complain about the homeless people being drug addicts or abusers of narcotics, is like, try living out in the streets for a week and see if you don't do drugs. I think that was one of the things that she said, and she was very articulate. She's very much more articulate than I could ever be. So
right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I would probably drink myself stupid just to if I was kicked out on the streets. And studies show that the number one cause of homelessness is job loss.
mhm,
And it's not alcohol or drugs, as most people seem to
mhm,
stigmatize the
right,
unhoused population. But there is a lot of trauma and stress that goes along with being unhoused. And then people self-medicate. I mean, we self-medicate now, even though we're in a home. It's like because of stress and trauma.
mhm,
So I don't it's a very small percentage of people that actually become unhoused due to drugs and alcohol. A very small percentage.
mhm,
The number one reason is job loss, and the second reason is what they call housing insecurity. And
mhm,
this is where most people are at. 50% of tenants in the Los Angeles County area are paying are paying over 30% of their income toward rent, which makes it sort of insecure, housing insecure. And so they're just a lot of us are just a paycheck away from
mhm.
not being able to pay rent. And so yeah, you get something like COVID happening, and it makes sense that the homeless population goes up, even
Right.
though there's tenant protections in place.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we heard, I think, of last year, I think towards the end of the presidential election, this idea of like a super rise like after COVID. But what we're seeing now is like this, I assume, as a recovery period. There are a few people that are making more money than usual after the pandemic, and there are a good portion of the population, probably the majority of the population, losing out. In after post COVID, and I think part of it, as we mentioned before, is like it's job loss, it's medical related. If you
Yeah.
have COVID, you're probably not working for at least 2 weeks, and God forbid if you are a COVID long hauler, that's longer, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's putting into perspective that this homeless issue is not just a set of one or two issues. It's a holistic thing of like, you can get into a car accident and you can't pay for your housing. You can get into a situation where you get diagnosed with cancer and can't pay off your housing. You say, people are one paycheck away from getting unhoused. I think Andrew Yang put it in one way. It's like you're one medical bill, you're one auto accident away from being destitute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I believe that. And then right now I do some work around utility justice, sort of like in my day job,
Mm-hmm.
and utilities are the second highest housing cost next to rent.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and if you don't have any utilities, then your housing can be at risk because then it's deemed uninhabitable. So
Mm-hmm.
there's all these different variations that can put people in a really precarious situation and at risk of being unhoused. And they say that moving, just moving, Okay, not like becoming homeless, but just moving from one apartment to another is just as stressful as the death of a loved one,
Mm,
right? So if you can imagine that, and then sort of tack on the fact that you may not have another place to go, and you may have to be on the street, so you can only like imagine how stressful the idea of becoming unhoused is, and that can be very traumatizing.
mm-hmm,
And so to me, it makes total sense that folks lean on alcohol and drugs to try to cope,
mm-hmm,
because there's no other way for them to cope. And then you have all these service providers that are there to help, and they want to help rehouse people, but that means that they have to provide all these different services to take care of them, like mental health services and just physical health services. And most of these organizations are really great at it, and they provide what's called wraparound services, right? So as the name implies, it wraps around the individual for all their different needs: housing, food, job, clothing, medication, um, uh, health checks, all this stuff. But it's difficult to provide that service when somebody's out on the street
mm-hmm,
and you don't know if they're going to be in the same place that they were by the time that you met them. So that's why it's important to house first and then wrap around the services to
mm-hmm,
ensure their success at that new housing. But
mm-hmm.
then we go back to where we started, right? You need that house in order to house them.
Right.
And so there's all different ideas on like what we can do to immediately house them, like little tiny houses, and things of that sort. People have come up with some really creative ideas to try to house folks as a transition, to get them off the streets, and then to try to wrap services around them. And I
Mm-hmm,
think all of these things should be investigated. Like, we should look into, instead of having a tent city, have a tiny house city.
mm-hmm.
Build actual like tiny homes, at least, instead of having them sleep and having to weather the the weather, right?
Right.
To the different weather. So yeah, I think there's so many things that we can do that aren't being done. And yeah, I think politicians just need to start doing something and opening their eyes.
There are some things that are being done, I think, that were put onto my radar. There's the emergency program, the Project Room Key. That's part of one program that's was born out of the coronavirus. I don't know how far this project has kind of was in the cards, either be pre or during COVID, but doing a storage container homes, I think, by the Twin Towers, incarcerating center, the correction center, right? The Twin Towers
Hmm.
Correction Center,
Hmm.
just right in between that and like Chinatown area. So I think, I don't know who heads it, but I see Hilda Solis sign up there. So I'm just like, it's probably her. But
Probably.
yeah, but anyways, there are things. The reason why I brought up Project Room Key is, like, I think for some of these services, they come with caveats also, like for the individual that is unhoused. And I think some of those things that were born out of the coronavirus times is like, it's very restrictive on the individual. And I think I've heard this before for Project Room Key. It's like they have times where people are allowed to go out. There's always check-ins and all of these different things. And for some people, it's much more simpler for them to just be out on the streets in their tents in their own kind of personal freedom than it is to, I guess, surrender to a system that, probably also don't see them as humanely. Although I do believe that at least Project Room Key did try to, it was born out of probably the hope that, you know, there's no tourism. Let's fill these spaces as much as possible. It was born out of the best intentions, but probably wasn't as executed. Given it was an emergency service, it wasn't something that was thought through and to the end. And even as we're looking towards the end of 2021, and I know this is barely the beginning of spring, but as we look towards then, what is going to happen? That's a terrible way of saying that. what is the end result once we don't need Project Roomkey? When hotel owners are saying, "Hey, tourism is coming back. Can we get our hotel so we could house these visitors coming into LA now?" Building up this new economy. Those individuals that were in that Project Roomkey program, what's next for them? Because
Yeah.
they're gonna go out into an LA County that, that house that you thought you could buy or at least rent is gone. It's off the market, and a
Yeah.
new family has taken it over, or somebody else has taken it over. So I just hope we're still gonna look down the barrel and of a huge housing issue still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I agree. Yeah, the cost of living, the cost of housing is like continuously going up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and our pay isn't. And
Mm-hmm.
especially with COVID, I mean, so many people have lost their jobs, so many companies and small businesses have gone under. So like, how are we going to afford living?
Mm-hmm.
As we were prior to COVID. And if we allow rents to keep going up, we know that housing prices continue to go up. So that ability to buy a home gets further and further away from people. And
Mm-hmm.
we know we know that all these, really big corporations are buying up single family homes and just renting them out. And so there's all of these different angles that this is happening,
Mm-hmm.
with, and we need to look at all of them. Like, we need to stop corporations from buying up all of these homes and renting them out. We need to build more housing. We need to ensure that people have adequate income. We need to make sure that rents don't continue to go up, or
Mm-hmm.
they go up commensurate to the rate of inflation. There's so many things that we need to do in order to be able to solve all of these issues. And like you said, going back to Project Roomkey, I mean, it helped hundreds
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of people. But is it a permanent solution? Probably not. But it was a good option. It was a very creative option. And I know that out of that, I don't know if it was Project Roomkey or another name of the project, where they actually bought up motels
Mm-hmm.
and converted them to affordable housing units. Those, I think, are more permanent and will continue to be that. But yeah, we don't need any more shelters. We
Mm-hmm.
don't need any more shelters. We need homes,
Yeah.
because the shelters are not. They're very restrictive, as you said. There's too many rules. Some don't allow pets. Some don't allow children, and they're overcrowded, and they're not. From what I understand, not all of them are of the best quality.
Right. And I know you mentioned something about here about children, and just the thought of um, young individuals going through the either being at risk of being unhoused or currently being unhoused, because I think the newer data now is suggesting, because of all of the things that happened with COVID, the even before then, the number of unhoused families with children is getting up there right now in California. And it's just seeing the thing is just, it makes me uncomfortable, because it's like, it's you see students come into the school and you're like, oh, you're just your normal students and things like that, but you don't know their situation unless you talk to them and things like that. And I don't know what is the ways to help that situation, especially for kids, because the kids wants to be with their family too, right? Like there was one idea a while ago that a school district was like, oh, well, let's just house the students at the school. It's like, yeah, we also don't want the school to be a prison for the students too. Like, that's a cool idea, but not something to like a long-term situation like Project Roomkey also. So like, I'm I know this is the I think of the children argument, but it is really these are the next generation. Like, I see children and kids as the next groups of people that will become the leaders, become the advocates, and things like that. And I just worry that, you know, if they're if this is their start, it's a really rough start. You're going to be
Yeah.
in areas with I wouldn't say drug addicts, but like you're exposed to more alcohol, tobacco, and I think not just tobacco, but drugs in general, and like firearms, violence. And I imagine that
Violence. Yeah.
in these encampments there could be violence, and under the freeways, with limited lighting, anything can happen. So yeah, this is the thing that kind of scares me the most, in the sense that homeless people don't scare me like a lot of conservative people would make it out to be, but it's more of just on a human level. Think of it in
Hmm.
terms of just being a human being. What does that
Sure.
do? Yeah. And I just don't, when developers are coming in and saying it's like, well, that's just capitalism. Is like when the classical capitalism is just says, there always got to be poor people. Well, it gets to a point where you got to say to an organized government that says, hey, we got to do something about this. We can't just have people just living, and putting them on buses and loading them to Oklahoma is also not the solution either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the mistreatment of people that are unhoused is a very real thing. When I was living in Long Beach, we had really large events like the Grand Prix, the Long
Mm-hmm.
Beach Grand Prix, and the Long Beach Marathon, and we would hear reports of right before those events took place. The unhoused would either be jailed or would be put on a bus and sent elsewhere
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't want to have any of them sort of with all the tourism that came in for
Mm-hmm.
those events. They didn't want to have them around. So I mean that's historically that's happened, and I believe that it continues to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the kids, I'm sure that we don't know how many children are actually unhoused, because them coming out or being found out puts them at risk of being being taken up by DCFS, the Department of Children and
Right.
Family Services, and taken away from their families, right? So if a social worker or the agents of the state, if you will, they find out that these children are unhoused, then well, now they're at risk of being placed in a foster home
Mm-hmm.
and taken away from their families. And so I would imagine that a lot of families don't willingly let folks know that they are unhoused, because that is a real risk,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want their kids taken away from them. I just, again, another system that is intended to help but can
Mm-hmm.
further harm people. Um, yeah, it's sad to think. I know, like, there's colleagues that I know that do a lot of work around college students that are unhoused,
Mm-hmm.
and that is another growing population as well. We know the LGBTQ community, and unhoused youth within that community is also another growing population. Um, the seniors is the number one growing population of unhoused people. And so you think about like your grandparents
Mm-hmm.
or your parents that are becoming seniors, and it's like to imagine them being on the street because they're on fixed income, they can't get a job, they can't afford where they live. And like I said, there's not enough affordable housing. So where in the hell are they going to live? So the fact that seniors are the number one rising population is just incredible to me, that
Mm-hmm.
we as a society can just allow this to happen, to have children and seniors on the street and say, oh well, that's just capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
the free market will take care of it. It's like, no, it's capitalism and the free market that got us into this mess, and it's not going to get us out of it. There needs to be some more progressive policies and reform and action taken.
Mm-hmm. Uh, just a quick anecdote. Like, yeah, I totally agree that the elderly is the next rising population of homeless individuals. There was interesting, of course, is a Vice documentary of because I'm a millennial. They were saying that in Korea there's a phenomenon where elderly people would rather be in jail than it is just to be homeless, because there is a
Wow.
huge population because of elderly people that feel that they're left out of society, because I guess Korean society has westernized so much, or like urbanized so much, that they've really kind of left their grandparents out of that equation. I'm not trying to chastise any one family, but like the phenomenon itself is like a lot of elderly
Yeah.
individuals are just left out of that system. And I'm sure other countries are facing that too. I could imagine Japan has to deal with that also, with their higher aged population than they have the more younger people. So that's things that we need to look into, and we're looking in almost into an immediate future of. I did want to ask you one thing, and I did bring up Austin,
Sure.
Texas earlier, and there's this
Hmm.
phenomenon right now that within Austin, Texas, the idea is that it's a bastion of very liberal, liberalism, and like all of these people that are willing to do like more housing and all of these different things. But a lot of the people that call themselves liberal, when they see homeless in their streets in front of their eyes, then like there is like their compassion level, like it's lost by a point or two, every single day,
Mm.
like the just seeing homeless. It's like you can talk about being liberal, you could talk about doing all these other things, but it's like once you see it, it's something that you may lose your humanity. It's like, I bought my property, and you start picking up these talking points where you thought, oh, those talking points are very toxic and all of those things. How can we stay, I think the question is, how can we make sure we still keep the humanity forward kind of conversations, and making sure that even though if we do see it, that we need to do something about it, not just say kick them all out per se. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a good question, and I think it's a very complicated answer.
Hmm.
I've been trained in different modalities of trauma healing, and what I've learned about sort of like the human brain and human development is like we're actually born to be very empathetic beings. Like we're
Hmm.
born with our brains are connected to have empathy. That's why like when a baby cries or hears another baby cry, it'll start to cry because it feels it has empathy for that other baby. But it's kind of like any muscle, is like when you don't use it, you lose it.
Hmm.
And as a society, we don't normally bring ourselves up with compassion and empathy. It's a very disciplinary, punitive child raising model that we have even in our school system. So as adults, it's much more difficult for us to connect and have compassion for another human being because we weren't raised that way, and our society uh, isn't fostering that skill set. So we forget how to be compassionate. We
Hmm.
forget how to have empathy for other human beings. And we focus, capitalism makes us focus in on what's mine, and how I get my piece of the pie. Right? That's what capitalism is. And so instead of being connected with other people and having worry or concern about other people, we're
Hmm.
more about like, I got to get mine and I got to protect mine, and anybody tries to threaten that is like, oh no, it's like we're gonna have beef, right? And so I think folks that come into like these communities where then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I just bought this property and I see all these homeless people around, they get all upset because their world and their property and their things start to be
Hmm.
threatened. And it's like, oh my God, I've worked so hard, I spent so much money, I finally got the house. It's like, I don't want to have all these homeless people around,
Hmm.
and so they have no compassion for them because it's all about me and my thing.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think it's a really complicated answer, because I think we got to go real deep as to why people don't have compassion for one another. um, and I think it's just something that we're going to have to relearn as human beings. We're going to have to like reestablish those muscles and those connections in our brain that allow us to be more compassionate and empathetic for one another. But if we're not supporting that ideal and supporting that in our society, it's like, oh, we're going to constantly run into these people that just don't have any care. And I think a little bit has to do with desensitization as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's kind of like what the news does. It's like you see the violence over and over and over and over again. At some point, you're like, oh, another shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, another, another violent act or another this. And the same thing with the unhoused. If you're just like constantly exposed to them and you have no interaction with them, you have no connection to them, it just becomes, that's how people are able to just like walk by and walk over unhoused people and just continue to go about their daily lives. It's just such a disconnect on a very human level from another human being, and it's really sad. It's really sad to see, but I think it's
Mm-hmm.
going to take a lot of work to be more compassionate.
Yeah, that's like the thing about like media and like news is like the juicy things are always the things of conflict, and it's like you hear every day. And like this is what's like the coverage of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement. Even before George Floyd, it was always trying to show, hey, this is this community, they're destroying this and this, there's a Target now on fire and all of these things, but really ignoring like what the movement is, or like putting the violence on the movement versus you know, it's like it's really kind of, I don't know, we see violence as entertainment, and it's like the fetishization of that is really toxic, you know. It's like, of course you could dabble in it, you know, there's all of these true crime documentaries, all of these things, right? But don't inhabit that every single waking moment of your life, right? This is not healthy.
Yeah,
It can't be healthy. And like I hope that people understand, like, we, instead of just looking at them as just a statistic, just a number, that these are human beings, these are individuals, these are families that has dreams, and probably through no fault of their own are in a situation that is very much untenable. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that it's very easy. Yeah, it's very easy to blame a person's individual actions and
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, it's like, oh, well, it's the whole idea is like, oh, just pull yourself up by the bootstrap. It's like, well, if you don't got any boots, it's like, how
Mm-hmm.
you gonna pull yourself up? And it's easy to blame the individual as opposed to blame the system that created that problem. And I think that's where we're at. Is like a lot of people say that the system is broken and it needs to be fixed or it needs to be reformed. And then there's the more radical people, which I probably more aligned with, is like, no, the system isn't broken. The system is doing exactly what it was
Mm-hmm.
designed to do, and that's to keep people poor and the rich get richer. And because they need to divide in order to maintain power, and they need to continue to oppress in order to maintain control. And so they don't want to lose that. They don't want to lose that power. They don't want to lose that control. And so they've designed these laws and these policies that have kept us, poor and oppressed for generations and generations. I mean, redlining and blockbusting and steering, these are all racially
Mm-hmm.
driven practices that kept people from owning property and building generational wealth. And so now we don't have the means, we don't have the land, we don't have we're just like sort of like floating around. And then we still use terms like landlord, which comes from, back in the old kingdom days when we used to like rent land to farm it, and we still use that term as if these people are the lord of the land,
Mm-hmm.
and still maintaining this hierarchy. Is like, so we still, even in our own vocabulary, we're
Mm-hmm.
still maintaining this idea that people are above us and have more power than us. And yeah, no, I think what we need to do is we need to dismantle the system.
Mm-hmm.
We need to dismantle it and we need to rebuild it brand new, because the system is working and it's working to continue to oppress us. And that's why it feels like we're like Sisyphus and, rolling the boulder uphill.
Mm-hmm.
You get a little ways and then it falls back. And that's how it constantly feels for me sometimes. Is like we're just we're in this uphill battle, and it's almost like you said, the people say we're fighting Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's hard and it can get really disenchanting sometimes, but that's why I think this abolition movement, abolishing the carceral system, abolishing all of these different types of systems, I mean, I think that's the way it has to go. Like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you have to break it down and build it
Mm-hmm.
new, as opposed to trying to fix the rot.
Yeah, the whole defund the police, or like, the redistribution of like where our public dollars go, and like if a police precinct deems it predominantly very good to have a tank, it's like, oh yeah, well, of course, city, write that check to the police department to get a tank. I was like, well, does the police need to have that? Can we invest those dollars somewhere else and like just have police do certain things? Most of the time, I remember listening to a separate podcast that Austin Police Department, ADP, the predominant role, APD, sorry, APD, the predominant role is events management. Like whenever South by Southwest comes by, or whenever there's a big concert, like that's really the role of the police in Austin. They're not there to bust down doors and do all of these things, like, and I feel to some degree we expect them to do a lot. And I think the thing is, if we divert funding and put it into more community things, I think what LA is doing is like, piloting UBI in some communities, in some families, or investing in mental health, investing in healthcare. Like that's much more better than over policing Black and brown communities. And I think that was the whole point of defund the police. And sorry, I have a lot of debates about this with my family. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think a lot of the so-called crime that the
Hmm.
police are trying to attend to is driven by poverty,
Yeah.
and is driven by people just trying to meet their basic human needs.
Hmm.
It's like we see that when there's a recession, is burglaries and home thefts go up. Why? Is that because people need to meet their needs? They need to make ends meet, and so they're going to resort to stuff that they might not normally do. And
Hmm.
I think that's why we see crime levels go up. And a lot of this is driven by poverty. And why is it that police seem to be policing the poorer communities more than they do the rich communities, when, like I just heard on the news, that white people cause just as many crimes as Black people, but yet we have more police in Black communities? you know Same thing for housing. If you put people into homes, well, guess what? You don't have to police them anymore, because they're not on the streets to be policed,
Hmm.
right? You can redirect funds from police that having to do all that stuff, which they shouldn't be doing anyway, because
Hmm.
this should be a social worker's job or a mental health professional's job, not the police that are dealing with unhoused people. And then just instead of hiring those cops, put them in a temporary transitional shelter and try to find them a permanent housing solution.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it makes no sense. It's like it's all ass backwards.
Yeah, definitely. Just so we slated for at least an hour. I do want to at least ask you these last two questions. So, in terms, we want to cap off the conversation of, we did talk about, a little slide of police brutality, or things like that. One of the biggest things is saying, that people are saying, why can't we have individuals in our community to police our community? And in the conversation for housing, it's a lot of corporations, it's a lot of investing groups and things like that. Why can't the developers come from our communities? Is there, like, would you agree it's better for local communities to develop versus these corporations? I think that's just my main question here, because I feel like if there's a disconnect, if you live in a different state and own property in LA, or like in Oregon, in Austin, or all of these places where there's a housing boom currently, and you don't live in those areas, is that okay for you to develop? Like, should it just be on a local term?
Well, I mean, if it can be done locally, yeah, absolutely. I think that would be the ideal.
Hmm.
Um, and until I guess the community is able to get to that point where they can develop on their own, is like
Hmm.
they're going to have to rely on outside developers, as long as, but again, they can, those communities can put the restrictions on the developers as to what they're able to develop,
Right.
and through policies and such. But there's other avenues, right, that are on the horizon that people should be looking toward. Like, for example, a public banking system.
Hmm.
If we had right now, the reason why folks that are undocumented or that have poor FICO scores or credit scores can't purchase is because the banks, the big banks, and Wall Street, they're all calling the shots. But if we had a public banking system where the people of the community that to put their money in there can develop loan products to help people that don't qualify for those big banks, to help people buy homes,
Hmm.
then, well, now the community can start driving actual home ownership or development, because now it's the community's money and the
Hmm.
community has a say on how they're going to invest it, right? So I think looking at a public banking system is really, really important for like very progressive things down the line.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then also just like there's the land trusts that are developing all across the state. People are developing community land trusts where they're investing money so that they can purchase publicly owned land and figure out what they want to do with it. Do they want to build housing? Do they want to build a park? Do they want to build a recreational area? They get to decide.
Hmm.
So there's options that people have, and they just have to start like putting them into place.
Yeah, there's very local examples. You do mention the like it's local banks is also like credit unions, right? Didn't LA had a ballot measure? I don't know if those was the last election cycle
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, but
To
it didn't. Yeah, it didn't go through. But
yeah.
it's slightly different than a credit union. A public banking system is like the people that have accounts there have a vote.
Hmm.
They get to vote on how they want their money to be used. So I'm depositing all my money in this bank, and the bank, while it's holding on to it, they can invest in stuff. So like the big banks like Chase and Wells Fargo, they can invest in fossil fuels. They can invest in
Hmm.
all these other things that might be hurting, that I'm against, but I
Hmm.
don't have a vote as to how
Right.
they invest the money. But in a public banking system, everybody that has an account has a vote, and
Yeah.
so it works like a co-op. So a slightly more progressive than a credit union, because I have my money in a credit union right now, but no one asks me how I want them to invest my money.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily have a vote.
Mm. I'm sure that there's an example that I could bring up and I could share. It's just it doesn't come to my mind right now. But the closest thing was like the LA Credit Union and also the Public Land Trust. Didn't the Long Beach area open a new trail from going from Long Beach all the way to San Pedro? And it was all part of that like whole land trust thing that like the community came together and said, hey, these former oil fields, like we got to use this as like park area, like Long Beach, San Pedro does not have a lot of green spaces. It's all kind of
Yeah.
concrete jungle. And so it was a whole community group that really did that recently. I think it was this year. I saw that on PBS in February. So
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as Long Beach and green space is concerned, it has a whole lot of green space, but only in the rich part of town.
right, definitely. My
Only
last
in
thing,
the rich part of town.
it's always the green side of the city, right? That's where
Right,
all the green
right.
spaces are. My last thing, I want to cap on this conversation, and I think it's like a wide um question always to cap off these podcasts. How would you rate or like the Los Angeles county's efforts in terms of coronavirus and in terms of kind of like housing and like do you feel optimistic and for the future of this area and like the advocates calling for more affordable housings, or is it going to be a little bit pessimistic future in your mind?
I'm very optimistic. I think that the county supervisors have really taken some really large strides. They've put all of these tenant protections in place, not just with COVID, but more permanent
Hmm.
protections that are helping all of LA County residents. They're doing what the local city councils haven't been able to do. and the fact that they're doing it, I think is a really great sign. And that's one of the reasons why we formed the San Gabriel Valley Tenants Alliance, is because we need to continue to organize and build tenant power here in the San Gabriel Valley so that we can join forces and continue to put pressure on the county supervisors to keep going on that path of progressive tenant protections, so that we can ensure that people stay in their homes and are not risk of being unhoused.
So we're gonna be wrapping up. Jorge, is there anything that you wanted to, anything in the future that the public should know, or any upcoming events in terms of the San Gabriel Valley Tenants Alliance, or the People's Resource Center? Is there anything coming
Yeah.
up that people should know?
Well, the San Gabriel Valley Tenants Alliance meets every first Wednesday of the month at 6 o'clock. We have a Facebook page with a link to those meetings, so you can check that out. We are at SGV Tenants on Facebook, and also through the People's Resource Center, we do free tenant counseling. And
Mhm.
so folks just have to call our 800 number, which is 888 758 8516, 888 758 8516, and then there'll be somebody to do an intake, and we can offer free tenant counseling to answer any other questions that folks might have. So
Mhm.
those are the main two things. We are going to be expanding our programs and our services as we move forward, and being from San Gabriel Valley, we are trying to extend our work here in the valley as well. So
Mhm.
be on the lookout for more.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm sure we probably have way more to discuss in the future.
Yeah.
Some of my podcasts, like some point, sometimes they go into 2 hours, but I want to respect your time. Thank you for
Yeah.
being on the podcast, and thank you, audience, for being here with me. And hope you subscribe, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.